That's it. A watch. My sister snickered, unwrapping my gift. Mom rolled her eyes and declared, "He used to give real gifts before he got stingy." I just smiled and announced, "You're correct. I used to." That night, I canceled every auto payment, messaged the bank, and locked the account. I, 32M, watched my sister unwrap the small box I'd placed under the Christmas tree, her expression already shifting to disappointment before she even saw what was inside. She lifted the simple digital watch, nothing fancy, just a basic timekeeper from the local electronics store, and let out that familiar snicker that had grated on my nerves for years. She made some comment about it just being a watch, her voice dripping with the same entitled tone she'd perfected since childhood. Mom immediately chimed in from her spot on the couch, rolling her eyes dramatically as she declared that I used to give real gifts before I got stingy. The living room fell quiet except for the crackling fireplace, everyone waiting for my usual defensive response or awkward laugh. Instead, I smiled. Not the forced, uncomfortable smile I'd worn through countless family gatherings, but something genuine. I told them they were absolutely correct. I used to give real gifts. The confusion on their faces was worth every penny I was about to save. What my family didn't know was that their stingy brother had been single-handedly funding their comfortable lifestyle for the past 8 years. After Dad died and left behind more debt than assets, I'd stepped up without being asked. Every month, like clockwork, I'd been covering Mom's mortgage, my sister's car payment, her insurance, groceries, utilities, and even her daughter's private school tuition. The auto payments came straight from my account, invisible and unacknowledged. My sister had married young to someone who talked big but earned little. They lived in a decent apartment, drove a reliable car, and never seemed to worry about money because Uncle Me had everything covered. Mom had maintained her middle-class lifestyle in the family home, never needing to downsize or adjust her spending. They'd grown so accustomed to my support that they'd forgotten it existed. But I hadn't forgotten their gratitude disappearing over the years. The thank you calls had stopped. The appreciation had turned to expectation, then to criticism when my gifts weren't impressive enough for their standards. Last Christmas, my sister had actually returned the nice jacket I'd bought her, claiming the color didn't suit her. Mom had complained that the spa gift certificate I'd given her wasn't for the expensive place across town. That night, after the family gathering ended and everyone went home with their respective disappointments, I sat in my home office with my laptop open. I started with the mortgage auto payment, logging into my bank account, and canceling the monthly transfer. $800 that would now stay in my account. Next came my sister's car payment, another $450 monthly. Her insurance, another $120. The grocery delivery service I'd set up for Mom, canceled. The utility auto pays for both households, stopped. My niece's private school tuition that I'd been covering since her parents claimed they couldn't afford it, I sent a polite email to the billing department requesting they contact the parents directly for future payments. I messaged the bank to implement a freeze on any recurring payments I might have missed, requiring manual approval for any future automatic withdrawals. By 2 in the morning, I'd systematically dismantled the financial safety net I'd woven around my family for nearly a decade. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later when my sister called, her voice tight with panic. She wanted to know if I'd heard anything from her bank about her car payment being rejected. I told her I hadn't heard anything, which was technically true. She mentioned how strange it was, since the payment had never bounced before. Mom called the next morning, confused about a notice from her mortgage company. She'd received something about a missed payment, but that couldn't be right because it was automatically handled. She asked if I knew anything about automatic payments, and I mentioned that banks sometimes had technical glitches. Within a week, both of them were dealing with late fees, phone calls from creditors, and the sudden reality of bills they'd forgotten existed. My sister discovered that her car insurance had lapsed, leaving her scrambling to avoid losing her license. Mom faced the prospect of her first mortgage late fee in years. The funny thing about money is that people notice it most when it's gone. For 8 years, they'd lived comfortably without thinking about where that comfort came from. Now, suddenly, they were forced to confront the actual cost of their lifestyles. My sister called multiple times, increasingly frantic as she realized the scope of the financial crisis hitting them simultaneously. She couldn't understand how everything could go wrong at once. The car, the insurance, even her daughter's school was demanding payment. I listened sympathetically, offering generic advice about calling the companies to work out payment plans. Mom was more direct, eventually asking if I could help with a small loan to get caught up on her mortgage. Just temporarily, she assured me, until she figured out what had gone wrong with her automatic payments. I told her I'd been trying to tighten my own budget lately and couldn't spare the cash right now. Update 1. 3 weeks after Christmas, my sister showed up at my door unannounced, looking haggard. She'd aged years in just a few weeks of financial stress. She wanted to talk, she said, about family and responsibility and how we were supposed to help each other. She sat in my living room and explained how difficult things had become. Her husband's income barely covered their basic expenses, and they'd apparently been relying on what she now realized had been my contributions more than she'd understood. The private school had given them a week to bring their account current, or their daughter would be transferred to public school. I listened patiently as she laid out their financial crisis, nodding sympathetically at appropriate moments. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to offer the solution she'd clearly come for. Instead, I asked her about the watch. Did she still have it? She looked confused and admitted she'd returned it for store credit. I nodded and mentioned that it was interesting how she could return a gift worth $30, but couldn't manage to keep track of thousands of dollars in monthly expenses. The realization crept across her face slowly. She started asking questions, careful, probing questions about automatic payments and monthly transfers. I didn't lie, exactly, but I didn't make it easy for her either. Eventually, she asked directly if I'd been helping with their bills. I confirmed that I had been, past tense. When she asked why I'd stopped, I reminded her of Christmas night, of her reaction to the watch, of Mom's comment about me becoming stingy. I told her she'd been absolutely right. I had been giving real gifts, just not the kind that came wrapped under a tree. She tried to argue that she hadn't known, that she'd never asked me to pay for everything, that it wasn't fair to punish her for not being grateful enough for something she didn't know about. I pointed out that she'd never asked where the money came from when her car payment went through every month despite her husband's sporadic employment. Update 2. The conversation with my sister opened floodgates I hadn't expected. Mom called that evening, her voice shaking with what I recognized as carefully controlled anger. My sister had filled her in on our discussion, and Mom demanded to know if it was true that I'd been manipulating the family finances without their knowledge. I found her word choice interesting, manipulating. Not helping, not supporting, not sacrificing. Manipulating. I asked her what she thought had been happening with her mortgage payments for the past 8 years, especially after Dad died and left them in debt. Mom insisted that she'd assumed the insurance money had been enough to handle the mortgage, that she'd never asked me to interfere with her finances. I reminded her that there hadn't been any insurance money. Dad had let his life insurance lapse 2 years before his death to save on premiums. I'd been the insurance money, month after month, year after year. She tried a different approach then, talking about family obligations and how the older generation had always helped the younger generation in our family. I agreed completely, which seemed to surprise her. I mentioned how Dad had worked 2 jobs to put me through college, how he'd sacrificed so I could graduate debt-free and build a good career. Then I asked what sacrifices she and my sister had made for anyone else in the family. The question hung in the air for a long time before she changed the subject to immediate concerns about her mortgage payment. I explained that I'd decided to focus on my own future financial security. I'd been contributing to everyone else's stability for years while neglecting my own retirement savings and emergency fund. It was time to be more responsible with my money. Mom's response was immediate and predictable. I was being selfish, abandoning family when they needed me most, forgetting everything they'd done for me over the years. I asked her to be specific about what they'd done for me lately, and the line went quiet. Update 3. A month after the revelations, my sister's husband called me for the first time in years. He wanted to meet for coffee, just the 2 of us, to talk man-to-man about the situation. I agreed, curious about what approach he'd take. He was more honest than I'd expected. He admitted that they'd been living beyond their means for years, assuming that whatever safety net had been catching them would always be there. He hadn't asked questions when their bills got paid mysteriously because it had been convenient not to know. Now they were facing reality. His income alone couldn't support their lifestyle. They'd already pulled their daughter out of private school, and they were looking at moving to a smaller apartment. His wife was applying for jobs for the first time in years, though her resume had some significant gaps. He didn't ask me to resume the payments, which surprised me. Instead, he apologized for not acknowledging what I'd been doing, for letting his family take my generosity for granted. He said he understood why I'd stopped, even if the timing had been brutal. I respected his honesty. I told him I didn't regret helping when they needed it, but I did regret letting the help become invisible and expected rather than appreciated and acknowledged. The watch had been a test, in a way, a small gesture to see if there was any gratitude left in the relationship, or if I'd become nothing more than an ATM to them. Mom took longer to come around. She spent several weeks trying to guilt me back into the financial arrangement, using every manipulation technique in her parental arsenal. She talked about Dad's memory, about family loyalty, about her age and vulnerability. When emotional manipulation failed, she tried practical arguments about my income versus her fixed retirement budget. Eventually, she realized I wasn't going to resume the auto payments. Her approach shifted to negotiating specific help with particular bills, trying to maintain some level of support while accepting that the blank check arrangement was over. I considered each request individually, helping when I felt the need was genuine and the request came with appropriate acknowledgement. The dynamic between us changed permanently. They could no longer take my contributions for granted because they knew I was choosing whether or not to help. Every assistance came with the implicit understanding that it was a gift, not an obligation, and could be withdrawn if the appreciation disappeared again. Update 4. 6 months later, my sister called with news that surprised me. She'd found a full-time job with decent benefits, and her husband had started a small business doing handyman work. They'd moved to a more affordable place and were actually managing their bills independently. My niece was thriving in public school and had made new friends. More importantly, my sister wanted to thank me, not for the current help, which was minimal, but for forcing them to face their financial reality. She admitted that being dependent on hidden support had been unhealthy for their marriage and their sense of self-reliance. The crisis had pushed them to make changes they should have made years earlier. She also apologized for Christmas, for the watch comment, for years of taking my support without acknowledgement. She said she understood now that the watch had actually been the most valuable gift I'd ever given them, the gift of having to stand on their own feet. Mom's adjustment took longer, but she eventually found ways to reduce her expenses and manage on her actual retirement income. She sold Dad's old workshop equipment, downsized to a smaller car, and learned to cook more meals at home instead of ordering delivery. The mortgage company worked out a modification that reduced her monthly payments. Our family relationships weren't the same as before, but they were more honest. Help was asked for explicitly and received with gratitude. My contributions were acknowledged and appreciated rather than invisible and expected. The entitled attitude that had built up over years of unexamined support began to fade as they adjusted to their new reality. I kept the watch, by the way, not the one I'd given my sister. She'd returned that one, but I bought myself the same model. I wear it as a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures reveal the biggest truths about relationships. It reminds me that real gifts aren't always the most expensive ones, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their dependence on you. The most unexpected outcome was how much better I felt about my family relationships once they became more balanced. When help was requested rather than assumed, when gratitude was expressed rather than expected, the interactions felt genuine again. I discovered that I actually enjoyed helping them more when it was a choice rather than an obligation, when my contributions were seen and valued rather than invisible and taken for granted. Looking back, that Christmas morning moment of decision, choosing to smile instead of defend, to act instead of argue, changed everything. Sometimes the most powerful response to being undervalued isn't anger or confrontation, but simply stepping back and letting people experience the true cost of what they've been taking for granted. The watch became a symbol not of my stinginess, but of their awakening to the reality of their situation and the value of what they'd been unconsciously dismissing for years.